This is not just an upgrade. This could be the loophole that changes the entire Formula One season overnight. Ferrari may not actually want to be the fastest team right now. Why? Because staying slightly behind could unlock something far more valuable: extra power, extra development freedom, and possibly two major engine upgrades that rivals may never get. And Miami is the place where everything begins. One race weekend, one official FIA measurement, one percentage gap that could decide whether Ferrari remains a challenger or becomes a championship threat. Because if Ferrari crosses that critical 4% performance gap, the entire balance of power in Formula One could change. At first, Ferrari looks like the clear second-best team. Strong pace, regular podiums, competitive weekends, but always just behind Mercedes. Close enough to fight, but not close enough to dominate. But the real story is deeper than lap times, because in 2026, speed alone is not the full game. Position relative to the fastest team matters even more. That is where the ADUO regulation quietly changes everything. Imagine a classroom where the best student sets the benchmark. Everyone else is judged by how far they are behind that student. If you are just slightly behind, the teacher gives you extra chances to improve. Not if you are too far behind, not if you are equal, only if you sit in that perfect middle zone. That is exactly Ferrari's situation right now. Some reports suggest Ferrari is around 2% behind Mercedes. Others believe the real number is much closer to 4%. And that tiny difference changes everything. At 2%, Ferrari gets one extra engine development opportunity. At 4%, they could unlock two. That means double the upgrade potential, double the chance to recover performance. And in Formula One terms, that could mean the difference between chasing podiums and fighting for wins. But here is the part most fans never see. This percentage is not decided by TV cameras or lap charts. It comes from detailed FIA analysis, sensor data, race telemetry, engine deployment, and real performance numbers gathered directly during race weekends. That means teams are not just racing each other. They are being measured every second. And Miami is the first major checkpoint where those measurements become official. But there is an even more complicated layer hiding underneath. Because if Ferrari wants maximum benefit, they need that gap to appear as large as possible, without actually falling too far behind on track. It is like walking on a razor's edge, pull too hard and look too competitive, and you lose the advantage, hold too much back, and you sacrifice points, momentum, and confidence. So what matters more? Immediate results or long-term dominance? That is where the real pressure inside Ferrari begins. Because while the drivers fight on track, the engineers and strategists are playing a much bigger game behind the scenes. They know Miami is not just about one Grand Prix. It could define how much power Ferrari is allowed to gain for the rest of the entire season. That is why Fred Vasseur said something very important. He said, Miami is where a new championship begins, not because of points, not because of standings, but because from that moment forward, the regulations start rewarding teams differently depending on where they stand. And if Ferrari lands in exactly the right place, they do not simply catch up, they reshape the championship. But Ferrari is not the only team thinking like this. Mercedes understands the same numbers. They know exactly what happens if Ferrari crosses that 4% line. Because if Ferrari gets those extra upgrades, they do not just become quicker, they become dangerous. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because there is absolutely nothing in the rules forcing Mercedes to show full power in Miami. Nothing. Think about that. The FIA measures performance using real race data. That sounds fair and objective, but those measurements only reflect what teams choose to reveal. So what if Mercedes holds back slightly? Not enough to lose, not enough for fans to notice. Just enough to make Ferrari appear only 2 to 3% behind instead of 4%. That is not cheating, that is strategy. Suddenly, Miami becomes a silent battle over invisible numbers. Ferrari wants the gap to look bigger. Mercedes wants it to look smaller. Both teams are fighting for control of the same percentage. And that percentage could define the season. The drivers may never feel this directly. They are simply attacking corners, braking late, pushing every lap. But behind them, engineers are making decisions that could decide the championship. Do you use full deployment on the straight, or do you manage the data instead? Do you chase victory today, or protect your future advantage? This is where Formula One stops being just racing. It becomes high-speed political warfare. Because once the FIA confirms that percentage after Miami and Monaco, there is no reset, that number becomes permanent reality. It determines how many engine improvements Ferrari gets. It defines how much power they can recover before the next major development window. And suddenly, Miami is not about who wins the race. It is about who controls the future. Because if Ferrari wins the data battle, even without winning Sunday, they could return later in the season with a completely transformed power unit, stronger, faster, potentially equal to Mercedes. And if that happens, the championship narrative changes overnight. But while all of this happens in the shadows, Ferrari is preparing something much more visible. Something everyone will notice immediately, because the car arriving in Miami is not a small update. It is a complete transformation. Originally, Ferrari planned to introduce upgrades step by step across multiple races, controlled progress. Time to understand every change. But those opportunities disappeared. So Ferrari made a bold decision. They combined everything into one massive package. One race, one reveal, one enormous gamble. And that changes the risk completely, because instead of testing one concept at a time, they are introducing an entirely new philosophy at once. The most important change is something most people barely notice: the floor. In Formula One, the floor is everything. It creates downforce by pulling the car closer to the ground without adding drag. Ferrari redesigned it for better efficiency, stronger stability, and more predictable performance in medium-speed corners, exactly where Miami punishes weakness. That may sound small, it is not. This alone could be worth several tenths per lap. And in Formula One, a few tenths can feel like an entirely different machine. But it gets even better. That extra grip helps mask engine weakness, less sliding, better traction, higher corner speed. Even without more horsepower, the car feels faster. And that is only the beginning, because next comes the rear wing. And this could change everything on the straights. Ferrari's new system is not a normal DRS design. When activated, the rear wing does not simply open, it rotates more aggressively, changing airflow in a far more dramatic way than traditional systems. The result? Less drag, higher top speed, potentially up to 10 km/h faster under the right conditions. That is massive. But there is a problem. The first version was unstable. At high speed and under braking, the car became unpredictable. At 300 km/h, that is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous, so Ferrari redesigned it. They adjusted the balance, improved the movement, and refined the system. Now, on paper, it works, but Miami does not care about paper. Miami brings heat, pressure, and reality. If it works, Ferrari could become the fastest car on the straights. If it fails, the entire weekend collapses. And because of that rear wing, they also had to redesign the front wing, not for extra speed, but for balance. When the rear changes aggressively, the front must compensate. Otherwise, the driver loses confidence. And when confidence disappears, lap time disappears with it. But Ferrari went even deeper, because underneath all of this lies something even more important: energy management. The software controlling electrical deployment has been completely reworked, and in modern Formula One, this matters massively. Power is not just about horsepower, it is about timing. Deploy too early, and you run out before the braking zone. Deploy too late, and the overtake opportunity is gone. Ferrari's new system aims to fix exactly that: smoother delivery, better consistency, more predictable performance. And most importantly, better control for the driver. One of Ferrari's biggest problems before Miami was superclipping. That moment when electrical power disappears at exactly the worst time. Fix that and the car becomes dangerous across an entire race distance. Now everything connects: new floor, new wing, new balance, new software, all arriving together with almost no testing. Because Miami is a sprint weekend, one practice session, that is all. No time for mistakes, no time for experiments. You either understand the car immediately or you pay for it, and that makes the pressure enormous. Ferrari is not just introducing upgrades. They are betting the season on getting everything right instantly. If they succeed, they force every rival to react. If they fail, they lose far more than one race, because with upgrades this aggressive, performance is not the only risk. Instability becomes the real enemy. Miami is one of the hardest places to manage that risk. High temperatures, low grip, walls everywhere. Tiny mistakes become huge consequences. Now imagine arriving there with a completely transformed car and almost no preparation. That is Ferrari's reality. And every upgrade is connected. The new floor changes grip, that changes tire behavior, that changes driver confidence, that changes energy deployment, that changes overtaking potential. One adjustment moves everything, like changing one gear inside a watch and affecting the entire system. That is why drivers like Charles Leclerc become so important, because now driving fast is not enough. They must feel the balance, understand the instability, interpret the behavior instantly, and make the right feedback under maximum pressure, because there is one final factor nobody can ignore: the heat. Heat exposes everything: cooling weaknesses, tire degradation, energy limitations, brake temperatures. If cooling fails, pace disappears. If energy overheats, deployment changes. If tires cross the limit, grip vanishes. Ferrari redesigned the side pods to manage exactly this. But theory is not reality. It has not been fully tested under real race pressure, so in Miami, we are about to witness something rare. A top Formula One team discovering its true pace live in front of the world. No simulation can hide it. No testing can protect it. Only reality. And this brings everything back to the beginning. While Ferrari fights to make the car work, while Mercedes carefully manages what they reveal, FIA is watching, measuring, calculating, locking in that critical percentage. And once that number is confirmed, everything changes, not just for Miami, for the entire season. Because if Ferrari gets this right, they do not just survive the gamble, they turn risk into the biggest advantage of the championship. But if they get it wrong, they do not simply lose a race, they lose the chance to change their future.